Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest Insignia webinar. This afternoon, we're looking at leadership and teamwork in crisis management, two key elements, but particularly looking at that from a military perspective. And there are many words from the military, not least strategy, tactics, scenario planning, even wargaming, which have been adopted by crisis management professionals and crisis management teams, but of course those are all originally military terms. And so to walk you through this webinar, you have myself, Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia, and we're very pleased to have joining us this afternoon Mark Wenham, who is a former British Army officer of 30 years plus experience, and Mark has kindly agreed to share his experiences from that career and give us some insights into how the armed forces train for what can be described as nothing but crisis situations. And then I'll try and link Mark's insights into how that might apply into the corporate world. But Mark, first of all, thank you very much for joining us, and perhaps you could give the audience just a potted history of your experience and your background, please.
Absolutely, Jonathan, and thank you for inviting me on to the webinar, and good afternoon to everybody that's listening. Just to give you a bit of background about myself, I was an infantry officer in the British Army. I started my service back in the 80s, so way back in the days of the Northern Ireland Trouble. And I've had various command and staff and training appointments since then that has taken me right the way through to last week when I formally left the service. I suppose the last 10 years or so I've spent in media and communications and strategic communications. I had a tour as the head of a military public affairs team in a NATO headquarters that was based in both the United Kingdom, Germany, and latterly in Afghanistan. And I was lucky enough to be a spokesman for British forces and for NATO forces in Afghanistan. And latterly took up an appointment running what was called the Defence Media Operations Centre, which was responsible for training military press officers and for deploying small teams to crisis situations wherever they were around the world that the United Kingdom was getting involved with, and also for capacity building. I had a short appointment last year to the Cabinet Office looking at cross-government communication strategies, and have had a number of projects sort of ongoing in the Caribbean and North Africa at the moment. So I think that's a quick potted history for you.
Fantastic, thank you, Mark. That's great. And as you can hear, Mark brings not only a military background but also an deep understanding of the importance of communication in a crisis context. If you have any questions during the course of this webinar, please use your question or chat box that you should be seeing on the right-hand side of your screen to put those questions, and we will deal with as many as we possibly can at the end of this webinar. We'll be finishing on the hour so that you can all get back to work this afternoon. And what we're going to cover in that hour really broadly are these four areas from, say, Mark's perspective. The importance of crisis management planning, the concept of training hard in order to fight easy, the value of rehearsal, and some really powerful lessons about crisis leadership. So if we take the first of those first, the importance of crisis management planning. Mark, I know that scenario planning is a key part of the way that the military engages in planning. Why and how does the Army engage in scenario planning?
Well, I suppose I should start by saying that in the military we would always say that no plan survives contact with the enemy. And I suppose to a certain degree that is true in so much as once you hit a crisis, the plan that you wrote is probably not going to work in its entirety. But the key is that the plan itself is there and has been prepared in advance. And we tend to use the scenarios that we are most likely to come across wherever we happen to be operating. And by and large, not exclusively, but by and large, these are predictable. And so one can foresee the sort of things that might happen when deployed on operations. And so using scenarios loosely based on previous incidents or what we think might happen provides us a really good insight into the sort of thing that we might be looking at. And that then leads us into the process itself, being able to understand the situation that will then assist us in decision making. That leads us to sort of what we call courses of action. What are the courses of action that we could take to solve this sort of problem that we might be looking at? And that will inevitably then lead us into wargaming, what we call wargaming or red teaming, where we might try and look at each of those proposed courses of action against what an adversary or other people might do if we take certain courses of action. And we might then adjust what we think we might do as a result of that. This is extremely valuable to us in preparing ourselves for those sort of scenarios that we're looking at. And of course, having that in the bag, as it were, and prepared when it does happen means we're in a much better place. And it can also, lastly, just lead to what we call indicators and warnings. So it allows us to look at what things we might want to put in place that could alert us to those sort of scenarios taking place that will gear us up and get us ready to deploy to whatever situation we may find ourselves in.
Why do you bother, Mark?
I'm sorry?
Why do you do this? What clearly takes a lot. It clearly takes a lot of time and effort to do it. Why bother? Because if you're not ready when it happens, you are more likely to fail. The sort of combat, the operations that we find ourselves in are incredibly complex. They require an enormous amount of understanding, and failing to prepare, as people say, you are prepared to fail. By not having certain plans and contingencies in place will almost certainly mean the adversary is going to be 1, 2, or 3 steps ahead of you, and therefore you find yourself playing catch up the whole time. Fantastic. Okay, so the reason for my pointed and somewhat impertinent question was really to draw the parallels for, in the corporate world. I think for the clients that we work with, there are parallels we can draw. You know, what are the key risks? What are the most likely things that could go wrong within your organisation? And if they were to go wrong, how would those likely play out? Mark talked about what would your adversaries do. For us in a corporate environment, what might your stakeholders do and say, and therefore how can we get ahead of that? So I would suggest that this is the first of, I know, many areas that Mark will talk about, that whilst the concept is rooted in a military background, it has a rich application within a corporate and a business environment. So, okay, thanks for that, Mark. The second area I wanted to explore with regard to crisis management planning is, how important is it to clarify roles and responsibilities during the planning phase? Yeah, again, I think for us this is a really critical area. Thinking now of planning rather than what might be going on, as it were, on the front line, but in the planning teams themselves, we need to have, if you don't have delegated people such as intelligence analysts, logistics experts, engineers, possibly even chemical weapons experts, policy advisors, strategic communicators, all these people who not necessarily work together every single day,
bringing them together with the operations people and indeed the planning people, but all coming together and understanding how each other works, inevitably makes the planning process and the decision-making process that a little bit easier, because you understand the dynamics, understand how each other works, and that inevitably means that the team is starting to operate and it's starting to gel that much better.
Excellent. And again, I draw the obvious parallel with the corporate world. I think it really is important to be very clear on what roles and capabilities you would need in a crisis event ahead of time, and making sure that you have those resources identified, trained and briefed. And of course, it's important that you don't just identify your A-team, because often the A-team is not available on the very day that you want them. So having deputies identified and briefed is crucial. I think we'll touch on this later, but I think Mark also almost alluded to almost your extended team. Yes, there'll be people within the business that you need to have as part of your team, but who are your critical suppliers and partners during a crisis, and have they been briefed and trained on your approach to managing a crisis situation? So, okay, a quick look at crisis management planning. To summarise, scenario planning enables better and quicker decision making under pressure. It buys you time when time is the most precious of resources. And defining clear roles and responsibilities ahead of time is essential if you want people to be doing the right thing in your hour of need. The phrase "train hard, fight easy." How much time does the army or the armed forces in general, Mark, spend training, and why?
Well, spend an inordinate amount of time training. I think, it's almost safe to say if we're not on operations, we're probably training. And the reason we do that is we hold so much store by it. The maxim of train hard, fight easy it tries to encompass that. You can't expect people to be able to do things without a high degree of training, a high degree of mentoring, whether that be working as an individual, knowing their own personal skill set, or actually how they operate as part of a team. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I might know how to use my rifle, but does that mean I can necessarily operate as part of a platoon in Lashkar in Afghanistan, for example? It probably doesn't. I've got one part of the building block, but I haven't got it all. Mm-hmm. And so you need to train for that, and it's being able to see how that works as an individual, how you contribute to that team that we set so much store by. And the team, the actual building block there is also incredibly important. Very, very small, can be up to 4 people, but those 4 people are part of a bigger team that's part of 8 people, that's then part of a platoon that's 30 people, and so it goes on.
Yes.
You get to a sort of revised organisation that could be 5,000.
And I think, the point I'd pick up on there is, you said right at the beginning that basically if you're not in action, then you are training. Clearly, businesses are hopefully not in crisis all of the time, and certainly would not logically be able to spend all of their non-crisis time training for crises. However, it does seem to me that it is risky, verging on cavalier, to not train corporate crisis teams for what may very well be the most pressurized, the most critical, the most traumatic day or week of their corporate lives. Actually failing to train a corporate crisis management team and just hoping that they will succeed, as I say, is very much a fingers crossed approach, which is probably not sensible, as I say, when you may be facing the most challenging day in your corporate history. Mark, how do you take someone with no experience at all and give them the skills and confidence to succeed?
Yeah, this does take time in our profession. You're taking individuals who probably had no experience of working in the military, might have had a little bit, and you're then putting them into positions where they've got to learn things quite quickly, they've got to learn to use equipment, they've got to be able to operate with other people, and then you've got to get them into an environment where we can replicate combat as closely as possible and get them operating in that sort of environment. So that is those sort of physical and mental pressures.
Mm-hmm.
And that all takes a long time to achieve. And we found that if you just drop someone in at the very deep end, they won't swim. They probably will sink, and they'll lose a lot of confidence as a result of that. So we always say, walk before you run, and we sort of go walk, crawl, run in our analogy there, because we like to get people familiar with their equipment, familiar with the team, familiar with the environment, and then build them up to the next stage. So it's a gradual learning process rather than a complete immersion in it, because quite simply, those really intense pressure situations, putting someone in it who's not used to it or is not familiar with it at all, almost guarantees a fail, and it also guarantees that individual or that team is going to lose an awful lot of confidence in themselves and in each other, which isn't necessary.
No, that's interesting, because occasionally we are asked by organisations to kick off a crisis management program with a full-on interactive simulation. And again, I would echo your thoughts there, Mark, that usually that is setting someone up to fail. And I think the incremental approach that you're describing is much more logical, as you've described. Develop the plan, brief people on the plan, train them on their skills, and then rehearse it. I think the only exception in our world is when maybe the organisation has made a specific decision that a crisis simulation is required as a wake-up call, and in fact it is frankly designed to highlight we have a lot of work to do, and the client identifies it's only by highlighting the realities of how well we are prepared or not that we're going to get traction for this program. But I would certainly concur that 99 times out of 100, the incremental learning approach is much more effective. Okay, so to summarise, training essential to build skills and confidence, and learn to walk before you can run. I touched on simulations in that previous comment, but we're going to move now on specifically to the value of rehearsal. We've just talked about training, giving people skills. We're now talking about practicing, rehearsing those skills. So, Mark, again, why is exercising so important, and what would you say are the characteristics of an effective exercise?
I think the requirement to be effective on an exercise goes slightly back to train hard, fight easy, in so much as we're trying as much as possible to create the type of environment that people will find themselves in. And that really means trying to enable them to face the stresses and strains that they're going to find in this quite hostile and quite alien environment. And that's quite difficult to do, to try and recreate that. But again, when we are rehearsing, we put a great deal of stock in doing just that. So, for example, it may be that we, inevitably in combat, you're going to have to face the reality of people being hurt, people being hit, and we will use real amputees with real simulation around that to shock, to a certain extent, people who've never confronted that situation before, because that provides the absolute realism that we're looking for, that as close as possible replicates the sort of situation that they may find themselves in on the battlefield. So quite harsh, but it provides a degree of what we call battle inoculation to the soldiers, sailors and airmen. And it might be, understanding what live rounds sound like nearby. So we'll conduct that in a safe way, but sufficient that the exercising soldiers realise what it's like to hear people, to hear the sounds of bullets firing right next to you, or explosions, or those sorts of things that will inevitably trigger a degree of fear, but a degree of realism that inoculates them ready for what they might have to face.
And I mean, that's a real exercise, that's a real simulation, and I don't think we've ever shot any of our clients, but I guess the equivalent might be the microphone and camera, which can sometimes have a similar effect on adrenaline, and I'd certainly again concur with the idea of simulations being as realistic as possible. It's not the real thing, but it's trying to make it realistic and as close to it as possible, because part of the value of a simulation is just in the experience, so that when or if it happens for real, you can draw upon that experience, you can draw upon what you learned in that realistic practice training environment and apply it when under pressure. So again, a very strong parallel, albeit slightly different mechanics within the corporate world. How do you make sure that the troops participating in those exercises get best value from that rehearsal, that they get the best out of it, Mark?
Well, I think the key here for us is not putting them under. You want to put them under pressure. You want to see how they're going to react. And as I said, I gave you quite extreme examples. If you're operating in a headquarters environment, as you suggested, that might mean the media turning up. It might mean, for us, in our case, an ambassador turning up. It might mean a foreign government official turning up. We try and replicate those as well as much as possible. The key to it is that people learn from it and feel that they're in a learning environment rather than a testing one. We're trying to build team relationships here. We're trying to ensure that they can learn as much as possible. And the reason we want to do that is because we tend to delegate authority quite low down the chain, as far as we can, in fact. It allows commanders to experiment a little bit. It allows them to innovate. It allows them to try things out that they might otherwise be too afraid to, too worried to. But we try and give them the environment to do that so that they can learn from those mistakes. Or, indeed, they can find that they've done something successfully, and that can be brought into their process or the team process.
Absolutely, and again, I think it is about creating a safe environment. I always think that if we run an exercise whereby everything goes perfectly, almost we failed, because it's about going out of the comfort zone, and as you've described, Mark, trying new things, sometimes not succeeding, but learning from that. It is, we believe, the opportunity to make mistakes without there being a cost associated with that. And I guess the other thing that helps to encourage that is the right corporate culture, one which, as we were talking about before, isn't setting people up to fail, but is allowing them to have the freedom to try things, to apply some of the tools and techniques we will have trained them in, and, sometimes get things wrong, but learn from that. So I would agree that, the word rehearsal is important. It is a rehearsal. It's a practice. It is not a pass or fail test. How about embedding roles and responsibilities? We touched on it in the earlier planning session, but what part do exercises play in embedding those roles and responsibilities, Mark?
Well, I think they ensure you've got it right for a start.
Yeah.
You may think you want one person, but actually you found out that you don't. You need somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
But the other part about that I find is that it's the ensuring that you have got everybody. Now, it's normally quite easy to make sure you have everybody from your own team, although sometimes mistakes are made there as well. But actually for us, because we never work on our own, it's making sure that we're working with everybody else we need to be working with. So, as an Army officer, that might be, we almost always now work in what we call a joint environment. So we're working with the Navy and the Air Force the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
But it could be that we're working with government officials. Quite often, in fact, we're working with people from the Foreign Office or from the Department for International Development or other government departments or organizations, that we will be on the mission with. We might be supporting those departments. So knowing who they are allows you to make contact with them, to build a relationship with them, and therefore when you deploy, life becomes that much easier as a result of that. Lower down, of course, that might mean working with emergency services. It might be the police.
Yep.
It might be council, emergency planning officers, and these sorts of people. But if you haven't thought about it beforehand, put them into your plan, at least got their telephone number, but more importantly, actually got them into the exercise with you.
Yes.
Then that sort of embedding, actually, you are then really training the team rather than just yourself, because of course it will be the wider team that you find yourself deploying with.
Yes.
In reality.
So again, I think the parallels are probably blindingly obvious, but in the corporate context, are there partners, key partners that you should involve in your crisis exercises, but certainly as a minimum, making sure that they are embedded within your crisis planning. The other point that I would pull out was something Mark mentioned at the start, talking about, getting the right people in the right places. I would build on that by saying exercises are great opportunities to actually identify the strengths of people under pressure, and you sometimes get some real surprises. People sometimes that you thought would rise to it and don't, but equally, the stereotypical quiet person in the corner who maybe you don't make them the spokesperson, but you discover through the exercise that they're the person that's got that insight, that can see something that unlocks the whole situation, or the one that's a really effective challenger, the one that can really put the perspective of the outside stakeholder. And again, it's only by doing exercises that you fully understand the qualities of your team and how they can be best used within a live crisis situation. Okay, how about embedding lessons? We've talked about learning from exercises. How can you ensure that lessons from an exercise are properly learned, Mark?
Well, the way we do it is we have a sort of fairly sort of strictish, as you'd expect, I suppose, process, and it actually applies whether we're deployed on operations or in training. I suppose that's train as you mean to fight, whereby there are people literally whose job it is to identify lessons by talking to the participants, gather those up into a report of some description, make the senior leadership aware of it, and literally go through it with the leadership to identify, not just to make sure that we've captured those lessons, but then to work out whether they are valuable, they are sufficient to require us to change something.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, quite often it can be situation dependent. Something might have happened because of a number of different circumstances, and therefore it may not be something that we need to change our procedures. but it may be something actually for the running of the exercise.
Yeah.
It may be an unreality been bred into the exercise somehow that has caused a reaction that actually is not relevant to reality. And that for us is a really important distinction to make. But once it has been taken and identified and then learned, it's putting it into our plans, our procedures, whatever it might be, and then going out and re-practicing it to make sure that that was the right thing to do, and that actually, yes, that does work, or it just needs a bit more refining again. So it's a continuous process, because we'll then come back at the end of all of that and look at, as well as looking at the lessons we've identified from the last piece of training, we're looking at the ones that we did before that, and making sure that the action we took was relevant and that it worked.
And again, Mark touched on it in what he's just said, but I'd also encourage organisations to learn from real crises or even near misses. No one wants a crisis to occur, but if they do, they are opportunities to build the resilience of the organisation, but that can only happen if the organisation takes the time to really examine what happened, why it happened, and what does need to be done different in future to either prevent it happening again, or at the very least to have the best contingencies in place to respond to it. The worst possible thing you can do is breathe a sigh of relief and go back to business as usual as soon as possible after a crisis, because that leaves you with a very real possibility that the thing that caused the crisis is still lurking in the system somewhere. Okay, so in summary, the value of rehearsal builds resilience to stress. I think inoculation was the phrase that Mark used. It actually gets you used to that pressurized situation. Rehearsals should be opportunities to learn, not pass or fail tests. They help to build relationships and teams, but they only have value if you actively choose to learn from them. In the second half of this webinar, we're going to focus specifically on the importance of leadership and teamwork in crisis management. So I guess the first thing that I would ask really, Mark, is people talk a lot about courage, understandably, when you're talking about the armed forces, but what does the term courage mean to you in the context of a leader role?
I think courage means a lot of things to a lot of people, but for me, there are two distinct areas of courage. One is perhaps the one that people associate with the armed forces, which is physical courage, the ability to get up and do something under the most incredibly stressful circumstances that requires an inordinate amount of, well, it's very hard to define exactly what it is that gets people to do those physical acts in those circumstances. But I think actually moral courage is also equally important and is something that people talk about continuous moral courage. And this is really about, for me, it's about doing the right thing. And some people say, yeah, it's doing the right thing, not just doing things right. So it's knowing that you're doing the right thing, making the right decision, the decision that is it's not for you. It's not the easy option. It's not what sometimes might be the obvious solution. It's being selfless about it, understanding that it's not about you, that it's about either your organization or the people that you're actually dealing with, most of the time it's about them, not about you. So I suppose for me, there's two aspects to courage. There's the moral and the physical. I think in these sort of circumstances that we're talking about here, sort of crisis environments, you do need both. You absolutely need both. But I sort of focus a little bit more on the moral because people tend not to think about that. They tend normally to think a bit more about the physical, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I guess, again, in a corporate environment, hopefully we are not required very often to demonstrate physical courage. But I do think in a crisis, business leaders do need to show moral courage. Again, you talked about making decisions which are right, but not necessarily easy. And I think that applies just as much in a corporate context. Sometimes there are, very easy decisions that can be made, but are they really the right thing for your stakeholders or your business? And I think the great leaders make the decisions which are right, not just easy. I guess the other thing that would link in is it requires courage to make a decision at all, and there are all sorts of ways that leaders can construct of not having to make decisions. But I think the best leaders, particularly in a crisis, are those that have the courage to decide and take the decisions that they believe are right. I mean, leading on from that, what are the key qualities, Mark, that you would say are required of a leader in that kind of battle role?
I think you've just touched on one of the important things there, is that ability to make a decision.
Yeah.
Quite often people will shy away from that, and they'll go, perhaps the problem will go away. And then before they know it, it's blown up in their face is perhaps the wrong analogy to use, but
yeah.
that indeed may actually happen. So it is that ability to, and that is something we look for in leaders, and we train into our leaders, is the ability to, even when everything is against them, and even when they haven't got the information that they might want, the ability to make a decision. And that to me, it's understanding risk and being able to react to it. Because invariably in a crisis, leaders don't have all the information they would want to make a decision. We tend to be quite balanced in the way we make decisions. We tend to gather all the information, think about it, cogitate on it, before we make what is inevitably a balanced decision that we're totally comfortable with. That's normal. In a crisis, in our crisis, that doesn't happen. You're having to make decisions with minimal information available. Fog of war, as people talk about. It is incredibly hard to make those decisions, and that's what we're looking for. But it's also, and I suppose that's sort of quite close into the problem. But also, for a leader, we're looking for the leader to be able to step back as well, to be able to see what the end is going to look like, to know the overall aims and strategic intent of their higher commanders, whoever that might be. It might be back in London, wherever, to be able to say, right, well, how am I actually moving this in the right direction, and distancing yourself a little bit from what's going on right on the line is equally important. But just knowing when to intervene and knowing when to put, as we might say, the hand on the tiller and just move it a few degrees one way or the other, it is, again, critically important to us.
Yes. A couple of things I'd like to add to that. I mean, something you said early on in that answer, Mark, about risk-taking. I often think it's an interesting conundrum that actually, in a crisis, particularly the leader has to take risks, and that feels like a strange combination. You're at a time of crisis, and yet you're required to take further risks. And the reason for that is, again, as you described, Mark, that the fog of war. In a corporate crisis, you do not have all of the information, all of the facts. And I touched on it before, that the leaders or teams that wait for every last piece of information to be there before they make a decision are the teams that don't make decisions at all or only make them when they're too late. And so actually, to be an effective leader in a crisis, you have to take calculated risks with your decision making, because perhaps the greatest risk of all is not taking a decision at all. So it's something that I think a lot of people feel very uncomfortable with, but it is critical if you're going to manage the crisis rather than it managing you. The second thing I just wanted to touch on was actually a question that's just come in, which is from a corporate perspective in reference to making decisions which are right. How would you suggest an organisation develops the appropriate incident management plan in order to delegate sufficiently to make decisions fast enough, especially when not all the information, facts and figures are to hand? And I'll give my quick perspective on that. And Mark, if you've anything to add, please do. And the first 2 or 3 thoughts on that. First of all, I think it's very much about creating the right culture. I think Mark talked earlier on about empowering people to make decisions. And for example, what could be implicit in this question, it's about understanding and making clear the scope of responsibility that's being empowered to a subsidiary company or a country office compared with head office. And our experience is that head office must be briefed and must be informed, particularly of serious crises, but the guy on the ground needs to be given responsibility for making those decisions because they will have the best information, but also understand when they have to put their hands up and say, I need your input here. So making it clear where roles and responsibilities lie, creating a culture in which decision making can take place. And then I would come back again to the critical importance of rehearsal. It's in rehearsal that you can test out how that decision making works. And hang on a minute, I thought that was a decision I was supposed to make. Oh, well, I thought that was your job. It's by going through it in a practice environment that can then be finessed. So, Mark, I don't know, any other views or anything to add to that?
Well, the only thing I would say from my own sort of from a military perspective, I suppose, but not, I don't think it's necessarily exclusive to that, is at the end of the day, this is about initiative for me. It's about maintaining momentum and gaining initiative, and therefore the best way to do that, as you said, is under pressure in a rehearsal type environment, and allowing a bit of free play so that you're allowed to see what happens based on the decision that someone has made in that situation and allow it to play out. And that can be influenced on an exercise as well. Important to the individual that they see the impact of their decision making.
And I think maybe also implicit in the question is, we're talking about right decisions. I think maybe the phrase right decisions is slightly misleading. I think maybe what we're talking about are the best decisions you can make at that time. And sometimes a decision is the least bad decision. It may not be the perfect decision, but it's better than no decision at all, and it's based upon the facts and information as you have them at that time. And it's only by making decisions and then taking action that you can exert any influence over a situation. Okay. I was just going to say, so we have 15 minutes left, so we'll aim to get through the rest of our discussion in 10 minutes, allowing at least 5 minutes at the end for any further questions. So how do the really effective leaders inspire their teams when they're under, incredibly challenging conditions, Mark?
I think one of the keys to this is it's not a single person that does this. Leaders happen at all levels, and in our case, we encourage that, and we try to empower as many people as we possibly can that have in our case, they have rank on their arm to some degree, but right down to the lowest possible rank, in the army, that's the lance corporal. We will empower them to make decisions. If you think of people walking around the streets of Helmand Province, the ones making the big decisions out there, more often than not, are corporals, young 22, 23-year-old corporals and young platoon commanders, officers. And we like to do that. We delegate that down as far as possible because that brings speed. It stops the sort of hierarchical barriers getting in the way, and they feel the confidence and have the trust of their superiors to make those decisions.
And I guess, Mark, as well, if I can just draw another quick parallel there, that's also, I think, what you're describing is about dealing with potentially minor incidents before they become big crisis situations. And again, we would advocate the same within a corporate environment, that if there's a culture and if people have been briefed that whatever your role is within your organisation, if you spot a problem, and you easily can, fix it, or at the very least, raise it, let people know that there's this minor issue here. It's when people feel it's not their job or that they're not allowed to flag up a problem that the minor issue turns into the festering issue that then one day blows up into a major crisis.
Absolutely. We reinforce that in our case as well.
Great. So, where should the leader be, Mark, when we are in the middle of a battle situation? Should they be at arm's length so that they can see the bigger picture, or should they be in the front line, literally inspiring the troops?
Well, you've kind of hit the nail on the head, Jonathan. It's the $1 million question, really, for us. So much of the time, we tend, I suppose, some commanders quite often at the junior levels like to get involved. They like to be part of it. They like to be directing the traffic because that's what they're comfortable with. They like to be able to see things happening and unfolding in front of them, which is fine. And there is to an extent, they need to be seen to be there, seen to be making decisions, seen to be allocating resources, and of course seen to be making those critical battlefield decisions. But at the same time, as we said before, you've got to be far enough back to be able to see the bigger picture, to be able to acknowledge the sort of where does this fit into the bigger scheme of things. Invariably, if I'm running a battalion or a regiment of 600 people, if I'm at the front of that, where people are engaged in a firefight, where there might be, say, 30 people involved, I probably can't see what the other 570 are doing. So I need to be able to put myself in a position where I've got access to the relevant information. And I think, to be able to make those decisions, you've got to have access to some information. So being able to influence events is critical, and you've got to be able to do that, but not so close that you're becoming completely embroiled in the contact battle, as we would call it.
And who would make that decision as to where the leader is deployed?
I think that's a leader's decision. That's the commander on the ground. He's going to determine where he or she should be. Now, they might get advice on that as well. Or might not be advice, but it might be a friendly suggestion.
Yes.
But nonetheless, at the end of the day, it's the commander's plan. It's the commander that is responsible at the end of this for whether it goes well or it goes badly, and therefore it is their judgment call as to where they position themselves to make that all happen. And in our case, commanders do it in all sorts of different ways. They themselves to go forward by taking communication systems as far forward as they can without making themselves vulnerable. They leave the staff behind to work on the plan, maybe, or they will determine that it's better to be in a purpose-built environment that's relatively safe, and they get better information from there. It it varies, or they do a combination of both, which is
Yeah.
invariably what tends to happen in the
Yeah.
majority of cases.
Now, again, very direct parallels with the chief executive. Do they go to the scene of the incident because they need to show empathy, they need to be with their people or the people who've been affected by the incident, and they need to see the reality of what the situation looks like on the ground, or, do they play a more strategic role and remove themselves from that operational element? It's the $1 million question, and it's a tough one. I think there's a real danger of the chief executive getting locked into the front line and not being able to get away. And one would assume that if chief executive has reached that level, then they have significant strategic skills to bring to bear. So I think there often is the requirement for the chief executive to be on site for some of the time during a crisis. I think sometimes they may, and frankly I am thinking of Tony Hayward in particular here, there is the danger of getting locked into that frontline role when actually you could maybe provide greater value elsewhere. What I would certainly say is within that crisis team, it's important that the leader plays a leader's role. On occasions I've seen very senior business people getting involved in some very minute detail which isn't best use of their capabilities. So I think that role of crisis leader needs to be carefully defined and again well rehearsed. The other thing I would mention is, and again I would use a military phrase, I think it can be very useful for the crisis leader or the CEO to have a trusted lieutenant who can have a word in their ear that, the chief executive might think they do need to be on the front line, but the person that they trust and respect that has a quiet word and says, yes, I think you need to be there today, but tomorrow we need you back here leading the company, rallying the troops at head office, whatever that role may be. So trusted advisors in a crisis, I think, can be very, very valuable. How important is it that the leader is a good communicator, Mark?
Well, again, this is vital. This is bread and butter for our leaders, or we hope it is.
Yep.
Communications is absolutely vital. They've got to be understood, and they've got to be understood by all sorts of different people, not least their own people. But it's also being understood by other people. They've got loads of audiences to talk to. That might be, if we're in a foreign country operating on behalf of the government, our own government, we might have to go through language barriers. We might have to go to people that don't know, have never seen a television before, who might just have heard a radio, but not much more than that, and might, importantly, not have the same view as us. And probably don't understand things in the same way that we would like to convey them. So there's a lot for a leader to do in terms of communication. But at the end of the day, it's about being understood, and that requires them inevitably to show a degree of authority, a degree of credibility, because that's kind of what people expect. But at the same time, and slightly counterintuitive occasionally in the military, is the requirement for empathy. To show that the commander actually does understand and does care for the people that you're dealing with or providing security to.
And I would, again, underline that in a corporate context. One of the things I've learned over the years is that people are asking of their leaders in a crisis, and I'm particularly thinking of employees within an organisation. They're asking at this most difficult of times, are they competent and do they care? And I think if, business leaders can tick both boxes, we're competent. In other words, we can fix this problem. That gives the rest of the business great confidence that we're still going to be around next week and next month, and that there is a future for us. And by communicating and by demonstrating that they also care, it retains that bond of trust between the team within the business and their leaders. Got one more question, and then we're going to wrap up. I think probably inspired by what we were just talking about, Mark. So the question is, and I guess this is because we've been looking at what lessons we can learn from the military within a corporate world. Question is, do you think a great CEO could transfer their skills to be a great military leader, so do it the other way around?
I mean, I don't see any reason why not. I think we're constantly learning from each other. And indeed, I've worked in headquarters that have had senior civilian advisors working alongside commanders within their own command group. That I've seen at the highest levels of military command, not at the low levels, but certainly at the highest levels. We do bring in civilian experts. We're always learning from each other, and I think it's incredibly valuable that we do that. And as this webinar has demonstrated, there is enormous crossover between the two, and therefore I think there is absolutely a place for both in each other's camps, as it were.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. So to summarise today's webinar, we've looked at 4 areas really. The importance of crisis management planning beforehand, the concept of train hard in order to fight easy, and the value of rehearsal, and that pivotal role of crisis leadership. Now, I wanted to make you aware that you can get more of Mark's thoughts on this topic via a white paper which is now on our website and downloadable from insigniacomms.com/resource, and we will send you an email with a direct link to that report, which covers all of the topics we've been discussing in even more detail. You will also have access to a recording of this webinar if you've enjoyed it so much that you'd like to hear it again. It's not on BBC iPlayer yet, but it will be available again tomorrow via a download. Please feel free to contact us if you have any broader questions about anything you've heard today, or crisis management, planning, training, testing, or handling in general terms. This is one of a series of webinars, and we will be running our next session in July of this year, so in 3 months' time. Do let us know if you have any follow-up questions following this webinar. But Mark, thank you very much for sharing those insights. We're most grateful, and I'm sure that everyone on the call will agree they're incredibly helpful. So thank you very much.
Not at all, Jonathan. Thank you for having me.
And thanks also to everyone on this call. We hope you found it useful, and we look forward to meeting with you again soon. Thank you.